Berlin in the 1700s was a city in motion, a growing royal capital on the flat Prussian plain, caught between old fortifications and new ambitions. Its streets were filling with soldiers, merchants, officials, and craftsmen. Timber houses leaned toward narrow lanes, while new stone facades announced power and prestige. Smoke rose from chimneys, and church towers and palace roofs slowly began to shape a recognizable skyline. In this video, some city views of Berlin to life. They allow us to shift perspective, glide above rooftops, and move down streets that once existed only as flat ink on paper. We can circle church towers, drift along the Spree, and step into busy markets in ways the original artist never could have imagined. Each view becomes a living window, letting us walk inside the images instead of just looking at them. First, I want to talk about the ancient heart of the city. This view shows the Berlin City Palace and Schlossplatz. Here the camera opens above the broad square of Schlossplatz, with the great bulk of the Berlin City Palace filling the midground. The palace wings wrap around an inner courtyard, their pale facades decorated with pilasters, high windows, and a forest of chimneys along the roofline. In the foreground, a stone balustrade and a few steps separate the viewer from the square, while in the background, church towers and clustered roofs hint at the rest of the city stretching away into the distance. By the early 1700s, this square was the ceremonial core of Prussian power. This view shows carriages rolling over uneven cobblestones, their wheels crunching in the dust, while liveried servants stand at the palace entrance. The air carries the smell of horse sweat, wood smoke, and the faint tang of coal from kitchens and nearby workshops. Court officials cross the square in heavy coats. A few street vendors linger at the edges, selling bread, fruit, and trinkets to anyone not too important to stop. Beneath the surface, tension runs quietly through this scene. The palace is a symbol of absolute monarchy, and the soldiers at the gates remind everyone who is in command. The crowds know that this is a place where orders are given, taxes are decided, and wars are planned. The narrow streets feeding into the square can easily clog with carriages and people, making it an anxious place whenever large processions or royal events occur. In winter, ice and packed snow turn the stones treacherous, and one careless step can send a horse or a servant tumbling. The city palace mattered because it concentrated power, culture, and administration in one physical space. Royal audiences, diplomatic receptions, and grand celebrations all passed through these doors. Decisions made here would shape not just Berlin, but the wider kingdom of Prussia. Later in the 18th century, renovations updated interiors and facades to reflect changing tastes, and the palace slowly became both a working residence and a monument to dynastic continuity. Centuries afterward, war and politics would tear this building down, and then modern debates would bring it back in a reconstructed form. Today, this same site is once again occupied by a palace-like structure, a place visitors can walk around, stand on the square, and imagine the 1700s coming back to life in front of them. This view shows the Brandenburg Gate and city ramparts. Now the camera glides westward, following a straight sandy road that runs toward a monumental stone gate in the distance. In the foreground, the road is lined with low wooden fences, small gardens, and a few scattered huts. The midground is dominated by earth ramparts and bastions, with grass-covered walls rising above a shallow ditch. The gate itself stands just beyond, framed against a broad sky, its passageway dark compared to the sunlit walls around it. By the mid-1700s, this gate marked the western entrance to Berlin, controlling who and what came into the city. This view shows farmers' carts creaking toward the opening, piled with sacks of grain, vegetables, and bundles of firewood. Soldiers check papers and collect duties, while stray dogs dart around the wheels. The smell of manure, damp earth from the ramparts, and freshly cut wood hangs in the air. Outside the walls, the wind feels open and raw. Inside, the city noise gathers like a distant roar. Tension here is built into the landscape. The fortifications promise security, but also remind everyone that war and siege are real possibilities. If trouble comes, this gate becomes a bottleneck, a place where crowds, fear, and military orders all collide. In bad weather, heavy rain turns the road into deep mud, slowing traffic and increasing frustration. Smugglers and clever merchants constantly look for ways around the rules, trying to dodge taxes as watchful guards patrol the ramparts above. The Brandenburg Gate and its defensive works mattered because they controlled trade and movement, the lifeblood of an early modern city. Every cart that passed through brought food, raw materials, and news from the countryside and beyond. Over time, the military role of these fortifications faded as new ideas of urban planning took hold, and the surrounding fields slowly turned into grand avenues and elegant neighborhoods. Today, the Brandenburg Gate survives in a very different form and context, a freestanding symbol in the heart of a modern capital. Yet in this reconstruction, you see it again as a functional threshold between fields and crowded streets. This view shows the Spree River and the old bridges. Next, the camera drifts above the calm, dark surface of the Spree, then dips lower so that the river fills the foreground. Timber piles rise from the water to support a sturdy bridge in the midground, where houses and stalls cling to the edges of the roadway. Small boats hug the banks, while larger barges slide beneath the arches. In the background, roofs, chimneys and church towers form a jagged line against the sky, softened by thin smoke drifting over the water. By the 1700s, the Spree was Berlin's watery spine. This view shows boatmen pushing long poles into the riverbed, guiding their craft through the bridge openings. The air is thick with the smells of wet wood, river mud, and fish. You can almost hear the dull thud of cargo shifting, the slap of water against hulls, and the constant shouted instructions as crews try not to collide. On the bridge, pedestrians and carts compete for space, weaving between market stalls that sell fresh fish, bread, simple cooked food, and small goods arriving from upriver. The dangers are not hard to see. A misstep on a slick plank can send someone into the cold water. Fires in the cramped bridge houses can spread quickly from shop to shop. In winter, floating ice jams at the piers, threatening to damage the structure and interrupt traffic for days. Contaminated water and poor drainage nearby help disease spread, turning the river's gift into a subtle threat for those who live too close to its banks. The Spree and its bridges mattered because they stitched together the two sides of the growing city and carried trade directly into its center. Barges brought in firewood, building materials, and food that kept Berlin alive. Over time, some of these older, crowded bridge houses were cleared away, replaced by wider, more open crossings that reflected new ideas of hygiene and traffic. Today, you can still stand on river bridges in Berlin and watch boats pass beneath you. Even if the shapes of the vessels and the buildings around them have changed completely, this view shows the twin towns of Berlin and Cologne around a market square. Here the camera rises above a busy open square surrounded by houses with steep roofs. In the foreground, you see wooden stalls, barrels and baskets spread across uneven ground. The midground is full of people standing, bargaining and moving through narrow gaps. On one side, a modest church tower rises, while on the opposite side, taller, more elaborate facades signal wealth. Beyond, in the background, another cluster of rooftops suggests the once separate town of Cologne across the water. By the early 18th century, the old dual structure of Berlin and Cologne was slowly merging into one growing city. This view shows market women in plain dresses calling out prices, their aprons dusted with flour or earth. Farmers stand beside wagons, guarding their produce. Children run between stalls, chased by tired parents, while stray dogs sniff at piles of refuse. The smell here is strong: fruit, fish, damp straw, smoke from small fires, and the sour edge of waste that has not yet been swept away. Tension in this scene comes from the density of human life packed into a small space. Arguments break out over prices or spoiled goods. Pickpockets move through the crowd, looking for an easy purse. A sudden downpour can turn the square into a muddy mess, spoiling merchandise and sending people scrambling for cover. City officials or soldiers may arrive to enforce new rules, pushing vendors to move their stalls or pay additional fees. These market spaces mattered because they were where country and city met every day. They fed the population and created a shared social arena where news, gossip, and political rumors spread quickly. Over time, some of these open squares were paved, regulated, and surrounded by more permanent structures, while others were cleared, redesigned, or overshadowed by larger public buildings. Today, in Berlin, many modern squares sit roughly where earlier markets once stood, even if their shapes and functions look completely different. This view shows a regiment drilling on a parade ground. Now the camera shifts to a broad, almost empty field at the edge of the built-up area. In the foreground, the ground is bare, a mixture of dirt and sparse grass cut by footprints and hoof marks. The midground is dominated by neat ranks of soldiers in uniform, muskets on their shoulders, officers on horseback circling slowly. In the background, low barracks and simple houses cluster near the horizon, with a faint haze of dust rising above the formations. By the 1700s, Berlin was becoming the heart of a state known for its disciplined army. This view shows soldiers moving in unison, turning as one body, the metallic click of musket locks and the shouted commands carrying on the wind. Drums beat out a steady rhythm, and the air smells of sweat, leather, gunpowder residue, and churned earth. A few onlookers stand at a distance, watching the spectacle with a mix of pride and unease. The tension here is obvious. Military life is harsh, and punishments for failure are severe. Recruits fear making mistakes in front of their officers, and the long hours of drilling leave bodies exhausted. This open ground becomes dangerous during live exercises, when misfires and accidents can cause injury or death. In times of political crisis or war, the same troops who drill here may one day be used to control crowds inside the city or to march far away to battlefields. These parade grounds mattered because they turned ordinary men into soldiers and projected Prussian power both to citizens and foreign visitors. They also shaped Berlin's identity as a militarized capital, where uniforms, marching columns, and martial music were part of everyday life. As the city expanded, some of these open spaces were later built over, transformed into parks, boulevards, or densely packed neighborhoods. Today, the memory of those drills lingers more in monuments and street names than in the landscape itself, but AI reconstruction lets this field appear again, as if the troops were still marching. This view shows a narrow residential street in the old town. The camera now drops into a tight canyon of houses, where a narrow, twisting street fills the foreground. The cobblestones are uneven, with puddles gathered in shallow depressions. On either side, tall, timber-framed buildings lean inward, their upper floors overhanging and almost touching in places. Laundry hangs from lines in the midground, and in the background the street bends, disappearing into shadows between the houses. By the 18th century, many of Berlin's older quarters still looked like this. This view shows residents stepping carefully around carts and barrels. Women carry buckets of water, children chase one another between doorways. A vendor pushes a handcart piled with vegetables, calling out to the windows above. The smells are intense, cooking smoke drifting from open shutters, animal waste, spilled beer, and the damp odor of wood that has soaked up decades of rain. Tension in this scene is built into the architecture. The cramped houses and overlapping roofs create a high fire risk. One spark from a chimney, a dropped candle, or a kitchen accident can send flames racing from attic to attic. Disease also finds an easy home here. Poor drainage and limited fresh air mean that illness can spread quickly through families living in tight rooms. At night, the darkness in these corners makes crime easier, and residents worry about theft or violence in the unlit stretches between rare lanterns. These streets mattered because they housed the majority of the city's population, the craftsmen, laborers, and small traders who kept Berlin functioning. They reveal a different side of urban life from the palaces and parades. Over the centuries, many of these older residential lanes were widened, straightened, or demolished altogether to make way for new boulevards and regulated housing. Today, only fragments of this older Berlin survive, but in AI reconstructions, the full pattern of leaning houses, crowded windows, and twisting alleys returns for a moment. This view shows a church square and Sunday life. Next, the camera rises above a modest square dominated by a church with a tall spire. In the foreground, benches and a few scattered trees cast shadows across the warm ground. The midground is taken up by the church porch and its steps, where people gather after a service. In the background, houses and small shops frame the square, their windows watching the central space like quiet observers. By the 1700s, church life was still at the center of many Berlin neighborhoods. This view shows families dressed in their better clothing, talking in small groups as they leave the building. Children play nearby, chasing each other around the trunks of the trees. A street musician stands at one corner, trying a tune on a simple instrument, while a baker's shop lets out the warm smell of fresh bread. The church bells echo over the rooftops, slowly fading into the ordinary sounds of the day. Tension here is more subtle. Religious expectations shape behavior and reputation. People know they are being watched and judged by neighbors and clergy alike. Political and theological debates occasionally ripple through congregations, dividing communities or drawing the attention of authorities. In times of war, famine, or disease, the square can transform into a place of funerals, public prayers, and quiet despair, as people seek comfort in ritual while fearing what lies ahead. These church squares mattered because they organized social life as much as spiritual life. They were places where announcements were made, alliances formed, and disputes aired. Over time, some churches were rebuilt, expanded, or relocated, while new civic institutions began to compete with religious structures for attention and centrality. Today, many historic churches in Berlin have been restored, rebuilt, or adapted, and standing there in the present, you can still feel echoes of these older gatherings, even if the clothing and conversations have changed. This view shows a merchant's canal and warehouse district, the camera now glides along a narrow waterway lined with brick and timber warehouses. In the foreground, the canal reflects the building. G's like a dark mirror, rippled by the movement of small cargo boats tied to simple wooden posts. The midground is crowded with stacked barrels, crates and bales on the quayside, while workers move along planks and ramps. In the background, taller storage buildings rise, punctured by hoisting beams and pulley systems jutting from their upper floors. By the 18th century, Berlin's trade networks were expanding, and new storage spaces were required to handle the flow of goods. This view shows dock workers rolling barrels, hauling sacks on their backs, and shouting to one another to coordinate loading and unloading. The air smells of tar, spices, grain dust, and river dampness. You can almost hear the creak of ropes, the splash of water against moored boats, and the rumble of carts arriving from the city streets behind the warehouses. Tension here lives in the daily risks of physical labor and the constant pressure of profit and loss. A misjudged step on a wet plank can send a worker into the canal. Heavy loads can crush fingers, feet, or entire bodies if a rope breaks or a barrel rolls free. Fires in these storage areas, fueled by dry materials and wooden structures, can rapidly become catastrophic, threatening entire districts and not just the warehouses themselves. These canal-side spaces mattered because they turned abstract trade into physical reality. Every crate represented a contract, every barrel a link in a chain stretching to other towns and distant regions. Over time, larger, more modern storage facilities and rail connections would change how goods moved through the city, pushing some older canals into decline or leading to their infill. Today, remnants of Berlin's older industrial and storage zones still exist, but often with entirely new uses. In Reconstruction, though, the canal returns to its role as a busy, narrow artery of commerce. This view shows a grand avenue taking shape. Now the camera rises above a long, straight stretch of road, newly lined with trees and more regular facades. In the foreground, young trees stand in neat rows along the sides of the avenue, casting small, delicate shadows. The midground shows wider, more orderly houses and official buildings with symmetrical fronts and clean lines. In the background, the road draws the eye toward a distant gate or major structure, hinting at the city's future growth. By the later 1700s, parts of Berlin were beginning to reflect newer ideas about order, light, and air in urban design. This view shows carriages moving more smoothly along the broader road, while pedestrians stroll on separated paths. The smells are lighter here: dust, leaves, and the faint scent of gardens, rather than the dense mixture of the older quarters. Street vendors still appear, but there is more room to move, and the sounds of wheels and footsteps spread out instead of echoing between cramped walls. Tension in this scene lies in the contrast between old and new. Inhabitants of the older quarters may resent the attention and resources poured into this more elegant area. Property values shift, pushing some people out and drawing others in. Construction sites along the avenue carry their own risks: unstable scaffolding, loose stones, and the constant threat of accidents as new buildings rise. These avenues mattered because they signaled a different vision of Berlin, a capital that wanted to be seen as orderly, rational, and modern. They provided routes for parades, promenades for the rising middle classes, and space for new institutions and cultural venues. Over time, the trees would grow taller, the facades would change, and new traffic, trams, cars, buses, would claim the roadway. Today, many of Berlin's main axes still follow lines first set in this era, even if the surfaces and sounds are entirely different. This view shows a winter scene on the frozen Spree. The camera now lowers to a snow-covered riverbank, where the Spree has turned into a sheet of ice stretching across to foreground. In the midground, people move across the frozen surface, some walking carefully, others pushing sleds or makeshift carts. A few stalls stand nearby, selling warm drinks or food. In the background, familiar roofs and towers appear softened by a pale winter sky, their outlines blurred by a light snowfall. By the 1700s, harsh winters could still transform Berlin's rhythms. This view shows children laughing as they slide on the ice, while adults pull firewood or goods across the frozen river, taking shortcuts not possible in warmer months. The air is sharp and cold, each breath visible as a faint cloud. The smells of smoke from nearby stoves and braziers mix with the cold, clean scent of snow and ice. Boots crunch on frozen ground, and every sound feels slightly muted by the icy blanket over the city. Tension hides just beneath the surface, literally. Everyone on the ice knows it can crack, especially near piers and under bridges. A misjudged step too close to thin areas can lead to sudden, deadly immersion in freezing water. Supplies may run low during long cold spells, raising fears of hunger and hardship. Fires used for warmth along the banks can also spread to nearby wooden structures if not carefully watched. These winter scenes mattered because they revealed both the resilience and the fragility of city life. The frozen river became a temporary new road, changing how people moved and traded, but it also reminded them of their dependence on forces beyond their control. Over time, improvements in fuel supplies, clothing and infrastructure made winter slightly less dangerous, but the memory of severe seasons lingered in stories and records. Today, the Spree still freezes at times, though the city around it is very different. AI reconstruction lets that older, quieter winter Berlin reappear, with skaters and sleds instead of modern lights and steel bridges. This view shows the city fading into the distance at dusk. Finally, the camera pulls back above the rooftops as evening settles. In the foreground, chimneys release thin twists of smoke into the cold air. The midground shows a patchwork of streets, squares, churches, palaces, and barracks, all beginning to blur into one continuous fabric. In the background, the city's edge gives way to fields and darkness, the last light of the sky glowing faintly above the horizon. By the end of the 1700s, Berlin was still smaller than it would later become, but the outlines of a capital were already here. This view shows the lamps being lit in streets and windows, one point of light at a time. Sound softens as work stops and people retreat indoors. Somewhere, a last carriage rattles over cobblestones, a dog barks, and church bells mark the hour. The smells of evening meals, coal fires, and damp stone rise slowly into the cooling air. There is a quiet tension at this hour between the security of home and the uncertainties of the wider world. Policies decided in palaces, drills on parade grounds, and trade on river and market will all shape what happens here in the coming decades. Wars will be fought, reforms enacted, and entire neighborhoods remade. Walls will come down,